Hey everybody, today is Monday, August 29th, 2022. Coming up on the show today, from Bodies, editor Taylor Levy.
It wasn't necessarily that we set out to make a comedy horror. For me, part of the journey of this movie that's so peculiar is where it started and where it is now.
And editor Julia Bloch.
There's parts of the editing process that producers and directors just don't know about because it's really happening in the edit and with the editor it's just a different perspective.
Yes, all that and lots more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, hello there. Welcome to The Rough Cut. It is I, Matt Fury, here once again to bring you some hot editing talk. On today's show, we are welcoming two first-time guests to the podcast. Fresh blood, if you will, which is an apropos expression because we are talking about the horror film Bodies. Horror film might be a bit of a stretch. It's a comedy/horror/thriller. But even that doesn't really get to the heart of the film. And that is why you want to talk to the editors. And those editors are Taylor Levy and Julia Bloch, two New York City-based editors who are no strangers to the fantasy horror thriller movie genre. As far as what the movie is about, A24, Bodies' primary distributor, describes the film thusly. When a group of 20-somethings gets stuck at a remote mansion during a hurricane, a party game gone very, very wrong ends with a dead body on the ground and fake friends at every turn as they try to find the killer among them. Fun stuff. The film premiered at South by Southwest this past March and was released in theaters, here in the US of A, a few weeks ago. Before we meet up with Julia and Taylor to get the inside scoop on Bodies, there's got to be a quick way of saying that, let's have a quick chat about our sponsor, Extreme Music. Since 1997, they have been providing filmmakers and other artists like you with the best in production audio. Music created by multi-award-winning musicians and composers. Great music from names you know and a few you don't. But they are all ridiculously talented in the art of music making. All you got to do is just go to their website, sign up for a free account, and then start your keyword search for any kind of music you need. I promise you they have it all and then some. You can get your track in all kinds of shapes and sizes, right down to the stems, which means you can do things like go with vocals or no vocals or just the drums or no drums. Sometimes you don't want drums. It is all up to you. It's fun, it's easy, and it's all right there online, or they can personally lend a hand from one of their many, many worldwide offices. They even have a Spotify playlist if you want to just kick back and enjoy what they got. I think they call that try before you buy. Or in this case, before you license. So make one of the best decisions you could ever make and partner up with Extreme Music to make your story sound great. Oh, I love meeting new editors. This is going to be fun. Here are Bodies editors Julia Bloch and Taylor Levy. Unless it's cute and funny and then I leave it in. But...
It's always cute and funny with me and Taylor.
And now we have the open for our show. Thank you, Julia.
Oh, God.
Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you guys, and it's a strange way to start things off, is what are you doing in New York City? I mean, conventional wisdom is that if you want to be a feature film editor, you need to be in LA. So what's it like trying to make a career as an editor in New York City these days?
It's an interesting question. We both have such wildly different paths. I know to that answer because I know Julia's history a little bit. But I don't know. I love New York City. I don't really want to live anywhere else. And luckily they make movies here too. And a lot of them, especially right now, it seems like there's so much going on. And ever since I've been working, the tax incentive has been around. And it's just kind of like, as much as I've always thought about leaving, something always kind of happens and then keeps me here before anything can get me to go across state lines.
Yeah, kind of similar. I mean, I want to live in New York City, so that's why I'm here. And I came here to go to college, and I actually did not study film at all in college. Got into it relatively later in life. Went on and did a full separate degree in something totally different, and ended up in film, which is a whole nother story. But I don't know. I think New York is just the place that keeps pulling me back. I leave, I come back, I leave, I come back. And I found a really great supportive film community here. And, especially in post-production, that's just what I know. But I really like working here. I like the community around it. And I've worked in LA a few times on shorter periods. And, I like that too. But this is just, this is my home.
Well, Julia, I'm going to have to ask, what was it that you studied that wasn't film?
The next best thing, comparative literature, which actually is something I think I lean on a lot as an editor because it's all about storytelling and narrative and character. And I just kind of got to a point where I didn't feel like I wanted to continue on an academic track, but I did get my master's in complet. And that was sort of the breaking point when I was like going to go into a PhD program, and then figured maybe not. I don't know that I want to like have a life of academic analysis of how other people tell stories. I think I want to tell some stories. And then there was like a whole other middle period of figuring out what that was, because I was very much more interested in text, reading, writing. You know, I didn't have the visual component to it at all until much later. I was working a temp job at an art gallery, and we got into some, you know, the artists that were at the gallery were sort of experimental and a little conceptual, but there was just this whole rich world of visual narrative that I got really excited by and started to lean more into that.
I generally like to start these interviews off by talking about how each editor came to be on a project. The situation with you two is interesting in that you didn't start at the same time, and until closer to the end, you really weren't on it at the same time, but I think all that will come out in the wash later. So Taylor, I believe you were first in on the project. What were the circumstances that led to you cutting bodies, bodies, bodies? And please, both of you, do you have a nickname for this film? Because I can't keep saying bodies, bodies, bodies.
No, you have to. That's the game.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, for me, pretty kind of like ordinary circumstances. Like, I was sitting at home. It was the middle of the lockdown. I was with my family and just like looking for what the next job might be, and got a script from my team. They were like, this could be fun. Give it a read, and they're thinking of you. And I read it and was like, one of those scripts that I knew I wanted to see the movie, regardless of whether I got to work on it or not. Felt lucky to read it. Felt super fun and like right up my alley. And then I think maybe a little bit later, met with Heleen on Zoom. We got along right away and felt like it was good chemistry, good fit. We both like kind of wanted to make the same sort of movie. And then I think 4 months passed after that initial meeting. And I got a call from them finally. And they're like, hey, we're finally making the movie. And do you want to do it?
Well, before I ask Julia the same question, you mentioned that they were interested in you. Are you aware of what it was in your resume or skill set that instilled that interest in you?
I don't know specifically, but I do know, or I could be misremembering, but I think the line producer that was initially involved with this project was a line producer I had worked with before. I think on like my first film, Night Comes On. So if I dig back in my memory, I think the initial email was like, hey, this line producer is throwing you out there, and they're curious. And then I think also Ali Herding, formerly from A24, now at Fruit Tree, me and her have kind of like circled each other professionally for years. So I think like she was mildly curious to work with me as well.
Going back to the New York thing, is there an advantage, or do you feel there's an advantage to be, it seems strange to say, in a smaller pool in New York City of all places, but Julia, you said there's a real filmmaking community there, and certainly Taylor, you talked about the tax incentive. Are there certain advantages to being in New York in terms of getting jobs?
I do think there are some advantages to the small pool, but I also wanted to talk about what Julia said before, which is like the community is in New York something. I don't know how it is in LA, but the community here is so strong that there's just a good unified front on making sure we're all like working or getting work or knowing what's going on for assistants and for editors too.
I think that it sort of depends on the kind of films you're targeting to work on. Again, gross generalization, but while there are more and more bigger films being made in New York, they're investing a lot even in the infrastructure of building studios out here in New York City itself and in, surrounding areas that are bringing more production here. But New York sort of still, I think the bread and butter are the smaller indie films, which we are all hoping and praying for the continuation of these types of films in our future. But, I think that if you have a certain sensitivity towards a type of filmmaking, both in terms of what you like to watch and how you like to work on smaller teams, I think there's just a lot more of that kind of like, let's make a movie ethos here in New York. So it might be, this is my theory, but I think it might be easier to kind of get in on the ground level here. There's a lot of smaller things, short films. People are just always looking for somebody to make something with. And so you can get some experience and you can start to meet people and you can kind of get in a little bit with maybe less prerequisites. And then I think that leads to, bigger things down the line. But that's kind of how it worked for me anyway.
Even though you don't need prerequisites, you both certainly have them. Julia, Taylor gave us his backstory on joining Bodies. I'm going to say the whole thing. How was it for you?
I was contacted by Allie and David, who are the two producers on the film. And they were at a point where they'd been working on it for a while and they were feeling like they wanted like a fresh take on some things. And I think that I've worked with A24 before. So I think, internally, like, I'm sure there's a lot of names on lists everywhere, but I think they just kind of came to me both because they're familiar with me and also because I do have some credits in the genre space. And so, they kind of approached me to see if I would be willing to come on and just kind of work with what they already had. One of the big differences is, I never read the script. I just started by watching a cut that Taylor and Heleen had been working on for a while. And so my approach, and I know Taylor's going to talk about this later, but, the evolution of how they even got to, from the script changed a lot. And the way the film got to where it was, I entered in at a place where you come in and you just look at what you have. So that's kind of, sorry, I just got off track because I was thinking I started to answer a question, go ahead of you. But how did I get into it? That was what happened.
Well, you can always go ahead of me. Most people are ahead of me. So don't worry.
I really hope you're editing this out.
No, this part's the best part. Okay, so building a little more on the New York filmmaking community thing. Taylor, when Julia joined, did you know her already? Were you familiar with her work? What was the relationship, if any, that you two had?
Yeah, I was definitely familiar and a fan of Julia's work for like years and years. I have a specific memory of us meeting at a bar back when I was an assistant. I don't think Julia would remember because I was just some little guy looking for attention. And she had tons of cool editor friends there. But like I said, that the community in New York is pretty small. So like we happened to have ended up at like a few little small functions, but never really like connected for any specific reason. So when she hopped on, I was like a little comfortable knowing it was someone, of, my same kind of sphere who, probably thought about things, approached things the same way. So I was excited to like get to know each other. And then, pretty fast friends, I would say.
Well, Taylor, you paint a really cool picture of Julia and her cool editing friends, her hip editing gang hanging out at the bar.
Don't doubt it.
So when she did join, what kind of discussions do you two have?
Because of Julia's, experience, she facilitated a really great conversation for us as we like kind of traded things off. And, we talked about all like the specifics of the movie a little bit and like what she was going to kind of approach and what my experience was in those areas of the film to let her know what maybe to look out for. And then, just a little bit like debrief of the situation, we're both handing off, the people, where the bodies may be buried and such. Just kind of like a standard meet and greet and like, changing of the guard sort of call.
How about you, Julia?
Yeah, well, I would say that in terms of I definitely did know who Taylor was, and I'm pretty sure I remember that bar hangout, but we hadn't really, we do have a lot of friends in common, but like we didn't, but it's also true that we didn't really know each other, like we didn't have like, and certainly under these kinds of circumstances, I'm very sensitive to this type of situation, certainly have been in the other side of it and have been all around it. It's a big part of working in film, and specifically, I think in editing, it happens a lot. And so, it was really important to me to touch base with Taylor before I started, hear sort of how things have been going from his side, because, I kind of heard from the producers and I heard from the director where they were at and what they wanted. But we all know that, there's something that happens. There's parts of the editing process that producers and directors just don't know about because it's really happening in the edit and with the editor in it's just a different perspective. And so I really wanted to be sure I understood sort of both from a like practical point of view, like where did Taylor feel he was leaving off? What were the things that were working and were not working, and what his experience had been working with this director who I wasn't familiar with at all. I had met her over Zoom also, but I hadn't worked with her or didn't know anybody who'd worked with her. So I was trying to get a little bit of background in terms of how that dynamic was going, all the things, like, did you try this? And what, how have you been working with music? And just all those kinds of aspects to what have you tried? What has worked? What has not worked? And then also on a personal level, just kind of wanting to be sure that the line of communication was very open, that I wanted to be very accessible, and, that let him know that he could ask me any questions and stuff that come up. And I also felt that it was really important that we establish that there would be an opportunity to bring Taylor back on at some point, that it wasn't just a full, like, okay, see you later. Like now, it's a complete switchover, both for just the reasons of personal investment in the project. But practically speaking, when someone starts a project, I mean, there's just so much information technically, and just like, and Taylor has such a good mind for like all keeping a lot of these details together and remembering like this, there's like, we tried this version of that scene and there's this and that. And so I just wanted to be sure that, as a resource and as somebody who knew the project so well, that we would be able to bring him back on for finishing. Because once you get into that aspect, for sure, like, in the DI and, once you're starting to do a lot of things kind of can come back even from the dailies phase. And, I think that's something that doesn't register for a lot of people, that when you're working on a film, there's so many different phases and you really go through different parts of the process with you use different skills in different parts of the process, and you're looking for different things. Your objective changes and your approach changes. And I think to go from beginning to end on a film is a really valuable process, and it can be personally very rewarding, of course, to like accompany the evolution of the film all the way through. If you're sort of cut off halfway there, it's not just about wanting to have the satisfaction of being there to see the finished product, but there's actually information, real knowledge that is valuable at the end. And I always say this, but I think like no matter what ends up in the film at the final cut, all the phases from assembling the dailies to all the different rough cuts to the really crazy ideas that didn't work, or the stuff that, you knew from day one you were going to cut, but you left it in there because everybody else had to come around, all that stuff is such an integral part of the process. And it often gets overlooked because people look at the finished film and they say, that's the film. But you would never be able to get to the finished film without all of the trial and error that goes ahead of that, especially in the early days, especially when you're dealing with the director's cut, especially when you're dealing with a director who's, this is their first or second film. They haven't been through the process that much. So I think all that is really valuable. So it was really also important to me personally, and just to, to cover my ass, to make sure that Taylor came back at the end so that we didn't have any holes.
All about you. Make sure I look good. Got to bring Taylor. One of the things I feel like might have been a challenge with this film is just understanding what it's meant to be. The description of the film, comedy/horror/thriller. I think one word that is missing is actually satire.
Yeah, well, now as it stands, it's certainly a comedy, horror, as you mentioned, satire film. But for me, part of the journey of this movie that's so peculiar is like where it started and where it is now. It wasn't necessarily that we set out to like make a comedy horror per se. Like if you look at the initial press releases, they all are like slasher, suspense, horror. There's not very much mention of comedy to start. That being said, partially what I loved about the script was how quick-witted it was, and the dialogue was really sharp. But the script was definitely concerned with being a horror movie at the beginning. And then as we got closer to production, it became a little bit like clearer, like these elements are, they're in the movie, but Heleen as a filmmaker responds more to these kind of other satirical elements and these more human elements. And so as the footage is coming in, it's like slowly getting a little bit clearer, like don't worry so much about the scares, worry a bit more about these interactions. What I think is so special about the movie is this tone, this unique experience the movie offers that's like somewhere between a few genres, between a few familiar experiences. Threading the needle that is that experience is kind of the long game of the edit of bodies in a sense. We got it to a point, and then that's exactly where Julia comes in to help with her fresh eyes and can see it for what it is, what it wants to be, and kind of just zero in on it a little bit further. But yeah, very tricky evolution that is just kind of about responding to the things that come in.
Yeah, I think, tone is such a tricky. It's so tricky because it's always the thing that people want to talk about, and it's really the hardest thing to define. And sometimes it just means you come in and you sort of switch out the music, and all of a sudden everyone's like, "Wow," And to be fair, we did change a lot of the music, and that was one of the first things we did. But like what I was saying earlier, when I first came on, I just cold watched the cut where they were at with it. I never read the script. I didn't have that little voice in my ear of all the conversations that had been going on from the beginning and all the different versions. And from what I understand, I think even while they were filming, because Helena, her background is as an actor, and she was very involved with the young women in particular who were the stars of the film. And their process, from what I understand, did involve a lot of improv and, kind of working through the script. And they worked on it a lot as they were going through. But again, I only came in at the point where a lot of that had already been sifted through. Taylor and Helena had gone through and made a lot of choices already. And what I found when I watched the cut, it was confusing in places as to what it was trying to be. It was a little bit neither here nor there. There are these great moments, like the centerpiece dialogue scene, or even like the big party scene right before they start playing the game, which worked completely in and of themselves. But to me, they didn't really fit within the whole of the film. And, when I saw it, it had sort of a more traditional horror type opening with some more like sinister music and kind of trying to create a feeling of anxiety. So I would say that the first things that I really thought needed to be focused on were changing the beginning of it, making it a little more lighthearted. It's one of those things where, you want to be taken on an adventure. You don't necessarily want to know where you're going. And you always have to sort of leave room for something to develop. Part of that, I thought, was this is really a story about this friend group and the horrible things that they do to each other. And then it's in the framework of this social media satire and sort of a Gen Z cultural zeitgeist thing. I mean, look, the director and I we're in our 40s. Like, we're not of this generation, So I think there was an element of having a little remove from it, but also seeing the theater of it. And it has to work on a level that's not just because you get all the memes and you get all of the musical references. It has to work because this is a story that could be set in any era, but it's using the cultural milestones of right now. And that's, I think, where a lot of the humor comes from and sort of the unique sensibility that we're talking about. A scene like that big dialogue scene, which we hardly touched. It was basically the same as when I got it. A little bit of tightening here and there, when you get to like the very end and you're like, oh, it just needs to move a little bit faster through some of this stuff. I hardly touched that scene because it works so great. At the same time, when I was watching it for the first time, I got to this scene and I'm like, why the hell are they talking about a podcast right now? Like, it killed the tension to me. I was like, are we where are we? Are we worried about our safety? Like, who are these people? What do they care about? And I was like, but at the same time, I was like, this is funny. Like, I get what I like this, but there was a part of me that was like not able to really just submit to the experience of what this movie was because I was so tied up in like not really getting what they were going for. So I would say that like the very first thing I thought we needed to do was establish these characters a little bit more purposefully. Who are these people? What is their relationship to each other? Who's Sophie and B? So like that drive up in the beginning, which, that we tried a lot of stuff with that to just how much information do you want to know or not? how we introduce the other kids and like the entry in and like making B feel like an outsider and sort of just setting up a little bit more carefully, taking our time in the beginning to really say, who are these people? What's their history, around the pool, the chit chat, and get those little like catty looks and the little digs and like, oh, okay, what's, and nothing, like no jump scares, no nothing until, then you get to a place where you can start to play with those other elements. And I think it's all about setting it up in a way that allows for the natural flow of what was already there to really just succeed.
It all takes place in this one giant McMansion, and it was shot on location in a real empty mansion. Did that include you, Taylor? Were you on site in this big, ridiculous house with a little bedroom off to the side where you had your Avid set up?
No, thankfully I was not there. I heard terrible things about this house, infested with rats and barely working amenities and just a not really nice place. So I was safely in my edit room in the city the whole time.
So going back to the handoff aspect of it, you're at a facility and not editing at home, it sounds like. And when Julia comes in, is it literally like, well, here are the keys? Or does she have a separate setup that you guys are moving media back and forth? How do the practical aspects of handing off a film happen?
It's very riveting. There was an exchange of keys. She walked into the office, sat down. The rest is history.
Really that simple, Julia?
Yeah, I mean, the assistant editor stayed on, so that was really important because John had been working with Taylor from the beginning, and also was there for all of these evolutions. So like if Heleen and I were working on a scene, and she said, "Oh, we had an older version. Taylor tried something with this line in." I could just ask John, "Hey, can you find this version?" And he had that all on hand, so he was sort of a link between the work Taylor had done and the work I was doing, because he was very familiar and was able to help me use all of that. It was also, I had to establish my own relationship with the director. I had to really come in and bring my own thought process to the material. That's what they hired me for. So it's a little bit, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. So I did want to get a sense of the history of the project, what had been tried before. But I also didn't want to just come in and kind of like feel like I was just continuing completely what had been going on before, because that was not the goal. The goal was to try something new. I went and watched older cuts, but I also kind of went back through the dailies from certain scenes and tried to look for new footage that wasn't in the current cut, maybe had been tried before, but maybe not. So yeah, that part, I don't even remember. It was maybe 2 months of just like that editing process. And then after Locked Picture, and you're starting to do like sound spotting sessions and talking to a composer and that stuff. And that's when Taylor came back on. And so then, yeah, we were all in the same room. I mean, it was just one editing room, and John, the assistant, was working remotely, but we had one room. And so, yeah, I mean, there was a couple of days where it was like, how's this going to feel? It's like the two of us in there and the director. But I think we managed it pretty well with, minor collateral damage.
Well, it's not I wouldn't say it's a unique experience, but it's certainly an interesting experience. Julie, did you create a new project and import or open up Taylor's timeline? Or you just sit down, write it? It still said Taylor is the user right at the top of the screen. You just jumped right in and assumed the role of Taylor?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just, I created my own user settings, obviously.
Well, that's what I'm trying to tease out. So tell me what you did.
Actually, I had just come off another job, and so I emailed my previous assistant on the other job, "Hey, can you email me my settings from the last job? I didn't take them with me." And so I just imported my settings and, yeah, fully worked on the exact same project. I just created a folder like JB work or whatever at the top. We just kind of really focused on, it was kind of on a theory also. Like I had I was very convinced of this idea, but of course, you never know until you actually try it, whether it's going to work or not. And so I kind of pitched to A24 that we weren't going to just like work on the whole film and show them a whole new cut. You know, they wanted to see the whole thing. I said, well, why don't we try this? Let's just do like the first 30 minutes, 35 minutes, let's like a first act kind of whatever this is. And if the theory is correct, and if it works well enough that it feels different enough, or it feels like it's going in the right direction, then we can pursue further, you know. So that's what we did. So Helena and I really kind of reworked the opening and like I said, the introduction of the characters and getting into the scenario. And then we screened for them the first 30 or 40 minutes. I don't remember where that took us to. I think it just took us into, you know, the first hide and seek section, and then the lights come back on. I think it was like into like Pete's death or something. Or am I supposed to not say that? Is it a spoiler?
No, it's it's okay. Don't worry about spoilers.
Okay. So I was like, yeah, because, you know, there was a thing where it's like, you know, it's degrees of tension, and you had to say like, if A, then B, right? And then like the premise is, does this part work? If this works, then this will work. If this doesn't work, then this won't work. You know, there's sort of a mathematical equation to it.
That's so film school, Julia. I can't believe you didn't go to film school.
I went to film school.
Well, that's a very film school way of looking at A meets B and goes to C to find D. It's perfect.
Well, I think the thing is that like the messy magic of a film like this is that when you're watching it, it feels a little chaotic. It feels like surprising. It feels like stuff is just flying at you. But there is a logic to it. There is a system to it. And, you know, you really do. This is, I think, at least for me, it's what has kept me editing for this long, is that I think you use all these different parts of your brain. You know, it's all of these different, you have to have intuition. You have to have a certain gut level of like, is this working? But you also have to be able to be very precise and really specific and clean about your choices. And it's the duality of that I think is what, I think you could apply that to any film, but since we're talking about this one, it's the macro and micro that everyone always talks about. You have to be able to do the scene work, and you have to also be able to fit the scene in the whole film. But I think it's also, when we're talking about tone, which, you know, to go back to that earlier question, you know, a lot of this stuff is very subjective. Horror is subjective, and so is comedy. You don't know, like there's things that, you know, that's the whole concept of phobias, right? Like something might be completely innocuous to me, but it will make another person not sleep for a week, you know? And you can't always put your finger on that. And you're not going to make a big movie like, or I mean, big is relative, but you're not going to make a movie like this one, which hopefully is going to be seen by a lot of people. And you can't put your finger on the pulse of everyone's paranoia. So you have to be able to find a way to just really articulate what is in this story and for these characters making this work. And that comes down, I mean, so much of it is in the writing and in the performance and the way that but then making it all come together, obviously that's, you know, in the edit. And that's the hardest part.
Well, let's build on that subjectivity of comedy and horror a little bit, and where the line exists between the two, because, and this also has to do with story logic. With a horror movie or a classic sort of whodunit, you have certain rules you got to play by. Like you can't just have, oh, the killer is some alien that came down from another planet that you never saw, or a character that was never in the film just shows up, although that kind of happens. You really have to give the audience clues and boundaries to work with so that the payoff is satisfying. But at the beginning of the film, two characters pull up to the mansion, they get out of their car, and one of the characters stays in the car and does her makeup in the rearview mirror, in the little mirror, the shade mirror. I can't think today. But you linger on the shot to see that, oh, she left the mirror down and the slider open and the light on. So obviously the battery is going to die in this car because she left that mirror light on. But the amount of time that you stay on that shot is the difference between horror and comedy. In other words, you stay on it long enough for the audience to clock it, but you stay on it a little longer, and it's almost like you're winking at the audience like, yes, I know that you know that we know that we're doing this thing. I know that's a strange edit to obsess upon, but tell me about that one particular edit, and did the length of that ever sort of change with that kind of thinking? Like, now we're staying on it too long, now it's kind of funny, or we're not staying on it long enough, we want it to be funny.
Yeah, I remember putting that together initially, and yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. That's what I was thinking when I first did it, is that the movie has a self-awareness even on the page. So I always figured some self-aware bits could, be the right move. And so we're leading into the pool. We're finally going to meet everybody. We're just kind of entering. And, it was one of those moments where you lay it in and yeah, exactly as you described it. Like you're watching it and you're like, okay, that feels like the place to cut, like just naturally. But if we just kind of wait just a second, then we're doing something like a little bit left of center, a little bit different, make you think maybe just a second more before we move on.
Julia hasn't. She's like, yeah, whatever. I didn't even touch that one.
Oh no, I'm listening. No, well, Taylor, I don't know if you remember this. I'm trying to remember because there was one thing there that I remember when I saw the cut for the first time. Did you have it where it cut from that shot to the underwater footage right away? Am I remembering that correctly?
That's how it is now, where it's like she leaves the car, and then we hold, and then we go straight to the pool. Yeah. That's what I had. Yeah, because I always went to the pool. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Or maybe there was a version, maybe you're right. There's a version where we don't stay with her. We just stay on the mirror, and then we go with B into the house. We don't go into the pool.
Yeah.
We stay on the mirror shot, and then we just track with her and go into the house. Yeah, that's right.
That's how it was, right?
Yeah,
because I remember when I watched it, as soon as it cut to that underwater footage, I was like, whoa, like that's cool. That's different. That's not what I was expecting. And that's one of those things that I think, when you talk about like teaching an audience the language of a film, not to get back into like film school stuff, but.
Oh, you better.
That's another thing, the underwater footage as it is in the final film, I don't think I touched, right? But I did change what we cut to from that, because I remember that was a very impactful moment, and I thought it was cool. I thought it was beautiful. It was strange. And it was such a wild way to introduce these people who like they've been talking about on the drive up. Who are your friends? What am I getting into? And so I thought it would be good to make it a sharper cut and just really just get in there and reveal Sophie, because Sophie had gone in ahead, and her whole dynamic with her friends without B, because B is, the outsider. And then we're trying to really create a stronger sense of that. So then we go back to B and let her come into the house, and she's kind of dwarfed by this grand entry and hearing the sounds outside, she's excluded. And then when she comes in, we've already met the friends and this whole thing. So that was like not a very big change, but it was something that I think kind of might help with this idea of also just getting the audience a little bit like, oh, like sitting up a little bit more, like, what's this? Hopefully that's the effect.
Yeah, initially there was a lot more kind of house as a character stuff, maybe on the page and in early cuts, where we go with B and into this, house is let's set it up, let's make it a big foreboding character. And then what the inevitable outcome is like, let's pull back a little bit on this storyline, because really the heart of this will be with this group of people. Let's get to the group of people, let's get the character dynamics in play and get everything rolling. And, Julia has it now. So you catch up with B a little bit later, and everything just kind of like snaps together a bit sharper.
Both of you have your reps, your prerequisites, as you say, in genre filmmaking and horror filmmaking. And I had a note to ask you about jump scares, because I like to talk about that with editors that work on those kind of films, because I think it's interesting the different techniques you can employ to make those happen. And I was thinking back about the film, and nothing really stuck in my memory. I'm probably just forgetting something, but I think a lot of it really more is just a lot of building tension and then some shocking images. But jump scares, I don't recall specifically. So first question is, am I forgetting some big jump scares? But the second question, really the more important one, is the aspects of the cinematography that you had to work with. I mean, the film's pretty much shot in the dark by the light of a lot of cell phone lights. You're almost in limbo. The character is in limbo. You can't really see a lot of stuff that's around them. I just wondered if there are any unique challenges to cutting footage like that. And does it help you build tension and create jump scares in that kind of scenario?
Yeah, I wonder if Julia will agree or disagree, but I do think jump scares they start with an intention, right? Like they need to be designed a bit and executed, I think, for them to come off the way we all are used to them working. And I was expecting to get, some of that type of footage coming in when we were shooting. But as we were shooting, I realized Heleen as a filmmaker has another instinct. She has another approach to some of these moments. And at first I was a little bit we're not going to execute a scare here the way I maybe would have thought it was on the page, but we're doing something else in a unique way that I think could be very cool if we can just finesse it the right way and just trust our actors a lot of the time, honestly. Just the actors in frame doing what they need to be doing is kind of what works most in bodies. So yeah, I'm curious if Julie would agree, but I find it was kind of a surprise on this one that I was expecting more of a bit of that kind of paint by numbers kind of scares in a few places, and then we didn't really get a lot of that. And then on top of that, Jasper Wolf, the DP on this film, who I think is just truly an incredible DP, because he essentially lit this whole house and it was ready to shoot almost in any direction at any point in time. Yeah, there'd be gear stashed in one room because they weren't shooting in there, but they could pull that gear out and shoot in there in a few minutes. It seemed things were happening really quick. And obviously we're dealing with COVID during the shoot, and there are days where actors are down. And so we're just going to pick up the slap scene is a great one where it's those slaps are occurring across weeks with 2 people in a room, 1 person in a room, 3 people in a room. And then in the end, you get a beautiful scene of everyone together in one room. So Jasper was really good at just kind of working on the fly. And Helena always loves to say that he's a war photographer, and she creates a circumstance where the actors are just kind of in this environment doing something as real as possible. And Jasper is just trying to capture it, it's happening. And that's exactly how they shot some scenes. The party scene, for example, is just wild footage of miscontinuity and changing ideas, and you just hope that you can cobble something together out of it. And that's what became the challenge. And even some of the not horror moments is we didn't shoot traditional coverage here. We just kind of walked around and we never happened to get this line on camera, or we never saw this actor do this little bit. We're going to find a way to manipulate what we have, or that's going to play off screen, or do it, live. And that's just kind of what became the nature of putting bodies together, was just accepting all right, we got to be here for this little moment because this is what we got. And usually because of the great acting and because of Jasper's work, it always at least felt kinetic and alive and organic, never too artificial.
I'd just like to point out that twice now Taylor just said bodies. So I think it's on the table that I can just say bodies. Was there an advantage to that so much being in the dark that you could, via after the fact doing ADR, punch things up or fix certain things that weren't working just by adding a voice that it's okay. I'd say we're in the dark. I can't see that character anyway. And so I can now fix something here that's not working just by adding a line later on.
What do you think, Julia? I feel like we were pretty sparing in the manipulation of that sort of stuff, honestly. I feel like if you watch the movie back, not too much is happening hidden in the darkness. It's all mostly, I think, right there. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it does give you some flexibility in terms of cuts, right? Because it's there's some you have a little more margin with continuity when you are things that are kind of happening. It's a little bit, muted. But I do think also, just to shout out Jasper again, not only was it so creatively lit and, but it's all handheld. And so, it's the focus, the framing, all of that was just super on point. And, which was a big asset for me, at least in the editing, because you're never having to I didn't do a ton of repositioning, or, moving things because the camera wasn't where I wanted it to be. The camera was pretty much always where you wanted it to be, and catching these little side glances as well, and in the dark, it was very fun, and you have shadow play, and you could kind of dial it up or down a little bit, depending on what you wanted to emphasize. And then, of course, when, the day comes at the end, when B steps out into the sunlight again, and you're kind of the whole house is revealed in this sort of bright sunlight. The contrast there, I think, was really effective too. It's kind of like you turn on the lights and look under the bed and there's no monster, But like Taylor said, I don't think we leaned on that aspect too much. I think it just naturally enhanced the ability to maneuver around the house and kind of play with things. That there's a lot of staircases, and sometimes, I would get lost, like, are they up in, because there's a front staircase and a back staircase, and where are they? And are they, and so we also tried to use sound a lot for that, because there's this storm that's raging outside the whole time, which ostensibly is the reason that they can't just leave. And so you had to make that somewhat convincing. And so we spent a lot of time in the sound mix on the right kind of rain and wind and making it, but also going in and out of the house and playing with bringing in, making it more violent when they were out in it. But also being able to still hear the dialogue and the music and, all of those things. So I think in the geography of the house, it was like the bedrooms on the top floor with the windows, and you could hear the rain and the wind and the branches a little bit more. And then when they go down into the basement, and there's that sort of gym space where they find Greg, Lee Pace's character, was almost like a vacuum with all the sound sucked out of it, because this was like some safe room kind of, and we did that to an exaggerated effect because we wanted it to feel a little bit creepy. We're still building tension at that point. It's the very beginning of the body starting to fall, and you're still kind of maybe questioning everybody.
You just reminded me of another element which I feel like has to be discussed when talking about this movie, which is shooting with these weather elements was, again, another thing that Jasper did so well. But, we have rain machines and wind machines, and the wind machines were maybe 6 inches beyond the edge of the frame. So there are countless scenes during the shoot that were unusable from an audio standpoint. Like, I'm getting the dailies and I'm like, I see their mouths moving, but I don't hear any words that they're saying. So there were some scenes that needed to be put together on the fly immediately. And then we sent them back to set, and then they would do wild ADR on top of those edits. And then that would kind of become how we put together some of those bigger outside sequences. But it was tricky. And then they had to re-record those same lines in the ADR booths at the final go. And so I'm pretty sure in that edit now, there's a mix between some things that we snagged from the production with tons of noise, some recorded while on set, some recorded in the ADR booth, and then some recorded on their phones just during editing. I'm sure a version of each of those file types is in that final mix now.
Well, proving once again that you two are always a little bit ahead of me, I was going to ask about sound next. And you both said a few things about geography, about creating tension, the importance of sound, specifically surround sound, even in creating tension, creating scares, making the audience aware of where they may be in an environment where it's hard to discern that just visually. And sound is another element where editors don't always work the same way. Just monitoring alone. Some editors, picture editors, I just like stereo or LCR, and other editors no, I need the 5.1. And if I could have 7.1, if the studio would allow me to have that, I would do that. So how did you, if you did do 5.1, did you do a lot of surround work yourselves before it went to the sound people?
We were just working in classic stereo. Yeah, indie movie style.
And is that typically how you both work?
Yeah, in my experience. I don't know about Julia. Yeah.
In the cutting room, definitely, because I don't want to get, I rarely even pan stuff that much when I'm just working in the cut. For me, it's more, sound effect placement, making, especially, things that are really moving the story along off screen, things like that, I get really detailed about. But placing things, I don't really worry about that at all, because I just figure it has to be readable from the point of view of if you're doing a test screening or something, you want it to be enough that you're not sending mixed signals. But it's something that I don't really spend too much time on when I'm focusing on other aspects of the edit. And then, I like to get into, not to mention in this particular editing room, it's when I came on, I guess in September, October. So it was, but they have all the ventilation. When you have these windows open in New York City cutting rooms, sometimes it's just the street sounds, it's so loud, it's like white noise.
They were building a roof like 6 feet outside that
The
window.
sound conditions in that cutting room were pretty terrible. So it was like I wasn't going to get too detailed about anything. So, and when you get into the stage and you're working with a real sound mixer and you're in a environment that's conducive to really getting into it, then I kind of switch focus to that. I'd say maybe to try to answer that in a more succinct way. I'm much more focused on the sort of storytelling aspects of the sound design, cutting certain effects and placing them, and then music in terms of how it plays out in the room. Yeah, just stereo. I try to keep it pretty minimal. I like to,
Yeah, I think we have that same approach.
Yeah.
We'll call that the New York style of sound modeling.
I've done musicals where I've done the LCR, and it just feels like a luxury. And anything that's a luxury, I'm usually like, well, we're not going to get that on this job.
I like that. Comedy and horror, again, so many similarities. Knowing when something is scary, just like knowing when something is funny. It's subjective, and also it's the kind of thing where, as an editor, you see it so many times, it loses that punch. It's just not funny anymore, or it's not scary, and you wonder, was this ever scary? Was this ever funny? And the importance of audience test screenings comes into play, or at least getting other opinions.
I'll let Julia answer that mostly. She handled a lot of the testing. We had some friends come in and watch kind of in like the later stages of things. But I will say that like for me, I'm a bit of a ham. And so when I'm working on something funny, it tends to not really lose its luster for me. I find a way to like continuously, at least I guess that I've been lucky to work on things that maybe are funny, I hope. But the horror thing is definitely, I found was real on this, where it's like, okay, I'm used to seeing this graphic stuff or the surprising stuff. And to me, that definitely kind of like loses its luster. Whereas, I don't know, I was laughing at so many of the things in the movie on the mix stage till the day we were done.
Yeah, we didn't do any sort of like recruited audience scored test screenings. We did 2 friends and family screenings when I was on, very friendly. And so, which I think was still great because, and we tried to get at least on, I can't remember if it was the first or the second one, but one of the 2 screenings, we tried to actively get a younger audience because, you want to be sure some of this stuff is landing with people that are, of the age of the characters in the film. And so, yeah, I think they were helpful, but there was a lot of comprehension stuff. Like, you could gauge a lot just by being in the room, of course, and you can see who's laughing or how the energy is in the room. And then the Q&A afterwards, I find can be helpful or not, depending on what your goals are there. I mean, I can talk about test screening as an overall concept with horror films in particular, because I have a lot to say about that, but we didn't do that on this film.
Well, give me the Reader's Digest version of your take on horror film test screenings.
They should not happen. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like, I do think there's genuinely, it's interesting to have, especially when you do these like, run by a marketing company, very, it's important to get the feedback of people who are not your friends and family and who are coming in cold for things like comprehension. Absolutely. But this whole business of scoring them when their questions are like, would you recommend this to your friends? Half the movies I see, I wouldn't recommend to my friends, but it's not because they're not amazing. It's like, I don't know. Do you like this particular kind of like art house gore? I don't know. And so, it's very misleading. And I think, it's pretty common knowledge that horror films in particular tend to score very poorly on these things. There's some legend about The Witch is the one I always heard, that it scored really terribly on the test screening. And of course, we all know how great that movie ended up being and performing at the box office, if you want to just take that particular capitalist perspective on it. Regardless of how good it is. No, but seriously, it really, not to mention I just think it's ridiculous. I think it comes from a place, you're going to cut this all out. Okay,
no,
Matt?
Ma'am.
I think it is totally misguided. I think that when you're showing these horror films that are incomplete and the visual effects aren't done and the music isn't done and the audio isn't done and you're exploring things and then you get some focus group and one person, I think it's, I've only done it on studio films where the people at the top of the food chain don't necessarily know what they want. I think it's a very fear-based practice. And I think it is a terrible way to judge the quality of the material that you're working on. And I think it also generally leads to firing editors when there are very low scores, which for all the reasons I've just said is usually what happens. And the first step after that is, well, this movie scored poorly, let's replace the editor, which, yes, that has happened to me. This is definitely, informing this particular rant, but it's happened to lots of other people I know as well. And I just don't see the use of it.
You reminded me though, we did one on bodies. It was like a marketing one, not like an actual.
But after the picture had locked, and we never, after they locked the picture, they did right for marketing purposes. They did one of those screenings,
and then we changed the picture a little bit because there was a bit of fear-based responses, you might say.
That's correct.
On any project, you should come away having learned something, I think, and certainly when you're working with another editor, maybe learning something from that editor. Was there anything you picked up, a technique, a approach to the job, an approach to storytelling from your other editor?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really interesting question for us, particularly because, me coming back and you never really get to see, or maybe it's different when, there are two editors on a film start to finish, which obviously happens all the time, but I don't know. But I got to see Julia interact with the director as an editor at the same time I'm interacting with the director as an editor. So there's like a mirror up of like, is that how I'll be in this exact scenario someday. You'll be in my scenario and you get to see, your friend and peer, how they would handle that scenario. So nothing's like coming to mind like specifically, but there were so many cases where I'm like, oh yeah, Julia had such the right way of saying that to the director where she like got her point across, but was soft and, which is the, greatest skill of any editor.
Yeah, that's so funny. That's not what I didn't know what you were going to say, but I guess kind of, I was going to say that actually right back at you because, again, one of the things, I don't know what percentage, it varies on day to day, but in some days, I think as much as 95% of the work you're doing as an editor is emotional labor and ego management. And it's particularly in the editor-director relationship that can come into play a lot. And it's such a big part of like the overall feeling in the room, but it does directly affect the work that's happening and how you can communicate your ideas. And I would say this is probably the biggest area of growth for me personally in the past 3 jobs I've had, each for different reasons, finding like ways in which, what works and what doesn't work when trying to both express myself and also listen to what somebody else is saying, getting feedback, whether it's the director or the producers. And like Taylor said, I mean, I've probably learned more from my interactions with other editors than I have from anybody else. And watching people work and, having conversations about how would you handle that. And so, yeah, from Taylor, I would say, is generally way more easygoing than I am. I would not use the word soft to describe my style at all, but I really am thrilled to hear you say that. I think that
I've witnessed it. It can happen.
No. Thanks. That means a lot. I'm really working on that. Because I get very passionate and I can get very like directive about my, and I think that I tend to work best with directors who are not threatened by that approach or who are able to also kind of engage on a level of like, I'm not talking about you right now. I'm talking about what this story needs. And not everybody works that way. It's like not necessarily good or bad. So I think you really have to have flexibility and, be able to walk into a room and gauge what's the vibe? How am I going to do this? And, to be very honest, that's just not a part of the job that I love, but it is really, really important. And I think Taylor has like a very, very solid grounding presence that is comforting. And it was to me too, like, especially at the end of this process where you're just like, you've built this thing up. We've gotten positive responses from our screenings. A24 was really happy with the film. Everyone seemed like really, but you're still like in this bubble where it hasn't really come out into the world, and you don't really, and we knew as we were finishing it that it was going to be going to South by Southwest, and we were finishing it in February, so it was like really a quick turnaround before it premiered, and so it was, tensions were high at the last, the very, very end of the process, and I think that it was really helpful to be able to just kind of like look over, across the soundstage and be like, did I just say that? What just happened? Like, and we could kind of check each other a little bit. So that was good.
Yeah, we became quite a team, which was really awesome. It was like, at the end of the day, walk to the subway. Let's debrief. How we doing? How was today for both of us?
Let's get a drink and debrief after like every sound session.
It was interesting working with Julia because, like, I just feel like she, from her, previous like life experiences outside of movies and then working on so many good films, like even just like getting to pick her brain as an editor, like really behind the scenes is a pretty valuable thing that not a lot of young editors will get the opportunity to do. But in terms of like interviews and coming up, like, I don't know, maybe it speaks to what Julia was just saying, which is like, I'm pretty comfortable in an interview. Like, I love movies and I love making movies. And so I usually just try and bring that energy to, my interviews. And most people I've been lucky to interview with also love movies and want to just like kind of talk about the things they really like and just get kind of excited about, making stuff. And as Julia said, like, the advice I always give like young people is like, you just more than half of editing is just being good in the room, like being a person who can like sit there and understand when to speak, when not to speak, when to, or how not to give off energy or something of that nature. And then when spoken to, managing to have something smart come out of your face.
Have something smart come out of your face is always a good bit of advice.
Well, it's funny because it's like, honestly, Bodies was a tricky experience for me being on and then going. And it reminds me of on one of my very first jobs, I witnessed something interesting, which was we're in the city working on a studio picture and things seem to be going really well. And then, the studio gets in and then before you know it, they're like, hey, so we're going to set up an edit room in LA, while you guys are in New York, and we're going to make a competing cut and we're going to make you defend basically every decision you make. And it was my first union job. And I was like, whoa, is this really like how it goes? And, that was the only experience I've had like that so far, but it was a good lesson to learn early because as much as we all love editing, like there is a lot of politics and some kind of heartbreaking things that can happen when you put your heart and soul into like making things with other people and collaborating. At the end of the day, it is a business, it is work. So there are people who have different bottom lines than you might have as an editor, and they got to, I guess, do what they have to do.
That is true. They will always do what they have to do. And what I have to do is let you two go because I've kept you for way too long, but I enjoyed the film quite a bit. And Julia, unlike your film, talking to me wasn't all that scary after all, was it?
No, you made it very easy and even enjoyable. So thank you for that.
That means a lot to me. Taylor, how does it feel knowing that a year from now, Julia won't remember talking to either of us?
Oh, God. You guys, what is this?
I know I'll still be leaving her voicemails a year from now, so she won't have forgotten me.
It's okay if Julia forgets about me. I'm used to it. But I will never forget talking with her and Taylor about Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. It's a fun movie and they were certainly fun to talk to. I hope you enjoyed it even half as much as I did. A warm rough cut thank you to both of them for making the time for us. If there is one thing you should not forget, it's to check out all the latest with Avid Media Composer. Not only did it help Taylor and Julia stack up those bodies, bodies, bodies into one neat little timeline, it can help you with any project you need to take on. So what are you waiting for? Hit that little link in the show notes and see what's new with Media Composer. That is going to do it for me today. I hope you had fun. I think I might have something a little different for you next week. Also fun, just a little different. So come on back and see what it is, if you like. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.